try this again. Welcome back to another Sister Storytime session with your favorite sister, Diana. We heard story. Sorry about that. Trying to get things fixed over here. Okay. Okay. So this is chapter 6, continued the self under siege and the book against the apocalypse. So, in lieu of ethnic and geographic detail, Shapiro anchored his descriptions in carefully wrought psychological portraits linked in a mysterious and altogether untraditional way to nature. In Shapiro's story, In the Dead Town, 9-year-old Belk lives among graves, where serenity and closeness to nature contrast sharply with the pain and suffering in the nameless shtetl in the valley below. From her vantage point atop a willow tree on the edge of the Jewish graveyard, Belk sees humankind as puny, breakable dolls, mechanical beings who bring nothing but misery and senseless violence into the world, free to roam about in a world of eternal presence. Belk responds only to the stimuli of nature, but there, in the natural cycle, she finds the link to her past. Belk's suppressed memory of the pogrom lies dormant, exactly like the snow covered river, which died an agonizing death with the onset of winter. As surely as the river will rush back to life with tremendous violent spasms in the springtime, so will Belk's memory reawaken with elemental, terrifying force. The storm pogrom equation was the key to Shapiro's radical agenda. Nature, he believed, was the life force, the main source of regeneration. Yet nature could harm as well as heal. A survivor such as Belk, cleansed by prolonged communion with nature, was then raped by the storm, which is to say, made to relive the trauma. If the cycle continued and the trauma were thus worked through, transmuted, then the beginning of self renewal could be traced, paradoxically, to the act of destruction itself. Similarly, and more radically, Shapiro implied that the violence of the pogrom, like that of the storm, could itself be liberating, even as it drove its victims to madness. Both through nature and through physical violence, people could purge that weaker part of themselves, break those civilizing shackles called humanism, politics, and culture to become Iron Men. Lean, towering, broad shouldered, with dark sun-tanned skin, protruding cheekbones, and black eyes. The hero of Shapiro's next story, The Cross, is the picture of well-being, a strong, silent type who travels the prairies on the roof of train cars, a Beowulf on American soil. The only giveaway is the crucifix on his forehead, two knife gashes, one across the other. When the story finally unfolds after the hero's symbolic purification in a river, it emerges that he is a Russian Jewish intellectual transformed and transfigured by the pogroms. Judging also from his detached manner of speech, he is a true believer turned cynic. It was a trivial matter, he says of those days, our desire to reshape the world, first Russia, then the other nations. Meanwhile, we were still working on Russia, sorry, as a member of a Russian revolutionary cell, he dismissed the news of pogroms as mere manifestations of the counter-revolution, with no bearing on him as a Jew. Stirred, however, by his love for Minna, the reticent and beautiful Gentile leader of the group, he is ready to sacrifice himself for the greater cause. None of this stands up in the face of the pogrom, which catches him totally off guard in his own home. He fights back ineffectually, is forced to witness the torture of his mother, a woman he always hated, and then, to save his Yid soul from hell, is branded for life with the crucifix on his forehead. At that moment, his ties with the past are broken forever. His prior life now appears like the slavery of Egypt, a form of a bondage from which he has to break loose at any price. With a single blow, he finishes off his dying mother and then steps out into a world in chaos. At one point, upon meeting his tormentor, he does not lift a hand to kill him. That would be too logical and too puny a form of revenge. In the supreme illogic of the streets, a Jewish student with a revolver shoots himself instead of the pogromist whom he has trapped in an alley. The hero's final act of liberation is to rape Minna and to strangle her to death. The pogrom instantly transformed a Talush and victim into its very antithesis, a man of action, a murderer, freed of inhibitions, emancipated from all that ever tied him down. In Shapiro's scheme, the pogrom released the pent up animal in man. Like preyed upon beasts, the victims bit and clawed at their attackers. In the kiss, Reb Shachny died biting the foot of Vasilenko the peasant. Belk lost herself in wild, intoxicating joy as she sank her teeth into the foot of the Cossack who was raping her mother. Men, women, and children alike gritted their teeth whenever their back was to the wall. This raw animal aggression had nothing to do with heroism, just as the man with the cross never acted upon his revolutionary ideals. Cut off from language and from a living community by the violence of the pogrom, the survivor animals found their habitat in nature, the purging ground of memory, and only there did they gain the strength to start over. Nothing captured the paradox of freedom through coercion and liberation through violence, as well as the symbol of the cross. Was the hero a victim, a suffering Christ, or Cain, the murderer marked for life? Was it a grotesque mandate for remembrance? This frontlet between his eyes, a question posed by the hero himself. Or was the cross to be construed as the crusader's badge of zealous action? The scar remained, any way you looked at it, and the transformation was complete. Victims became victors or turned the violence back on themselves. Loved turned to hatred, hatred to madness, and madness to health. Nothing would be what it was. No one would return to the person he had been. On a pragmatic level, the man with the cross represented a new kind of hero, an Iron Man who would, in the words of the story's narrator, rebuild what we had permitted to be ruined. Here was the first Talush ever to be reborn as a Beowulf, though his later fate was an open question. Someone so brutally disabused of politics could not very well return to lead a strike or drain a swamp. Secular humanism, Shapiro's argument went, did not stand up to primal aggression, nor had all attempts, as old as civilization itself, succeeded in taming and rechanneling that aggression. In order to reverse a time honored legacy of denial, Shapiro knew that he would have to look beyond the self under siege and take on God as well. To make the pogrom into the ultimate parody, a repudiation so total that it canceled out all prior notions of man created in the image of God, he had to subvert the myths of both Judaism and Christianity and launch a counter commentary such as no one since Bialik had yet attempted. Taken in sequence, Shapiro's abuse of scripture and liturgy shows a definite progression. Reb Shakney could have avoided a violent death if he had agreed to kiss the swollen, filthy foot of his tormentor, or have died a martyr's death by refusing. Instead, he sank his teeth into the foot in open rebellion against the enemy and in hidden defiance of the death reserved for the righteous, to die as did Moses with the kiss of God. In the same way, the Passover saga of redemption, celebrated in the freedom of New York, was eclipsed by the Father's savage cry for revenge. Pour out thy wrath, signaling to the 9-year-old hero that, having survived the pogrom, he and his family were to suffer its consequences as long as they lived. Soon after Passover, his mother would give birth to a bastard, the fruit of old world violence that God had done nothing to stop. In The Cross of 1909, it was the Christian God who showed his true colors when there came a peasant to make the sign of the cross, literally and figuratively, over his victim. With this single act, brotherly love was converted into sadism, remembrance into oblivion, pogromist into Jew. In telling Belk's story in 1910, Shapiro had to step out of the prose narrative to deliver the parting words. The fatal determinism of mechanical beings dancing to the tune of death was all the doing of God in a striped and spotted robe and trousers, half yellow, half red. He's playing a comb and blowing a flute, and life goes dancing with death. So long as humans took their cues from the clown god instead of from nature, they would never rise above the pathetic and the grotesque. In each case, therefore, acts of primal aggression, of biting, screaming, mutilating, and murdering, repudiated other items in the catalog of Western spirituality: quiescence, redemption, salvation, and providence. But these subversions were still pot shots compared to the sweep of Shapiro's last two pogrom stories, published in 1919. From the opening tableau of the Jewish state, the Kehillah Kedosha, bound to God by divine law, seems perfectly intact. The face of the rabbi's daughter-in-law, a recent bride, is visible in public only when covered with a white silk kerchief and only through the arch-shaped wicket in the oaken door to the women's section of the synagogue. It is Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. With each carefully chosen detail, another strand is added to the web of sanctity that surrounds the rabbi. His son, Menachem, Menachem's new wife, the rabbi's wife, and the absent-minded cook, Slove. Whatever the signs of sensuality, Gershon the slaughterer,'s secret passion for the daughter-in-law, or Menachem's strong baritone voice when he studied out loud, they are held in check by the normative structures, perhaps overly so, since Menachem is too bashful to sleep with his wife. Then, 3 weeks after Sukkoth, comes the pogrom, which is bypassed entirely by the author, but whose after effects are immediately visible. All of Krivodov gathered in the large synagogue. The oaken door had been opened and both sections joined into one. Men, women, and children all sitting together. The adults are fasting voluntarily in a penitence very different from that of Yom Kippur. Gershon, the slaughterer,'s hand is in a sling. The rabbi's wife is mortally wounded. Despite the losses, the community has reconvened in the house of prayer, and it is time to record their tribulations in prescribed liturgical fashion. Reye Adonai me hoyo lonu. See, O Lord, what hath befallen us. We were led like sheep to the slaughter, and they plundered our possessions, and they profaned thy name among the nations. But once the oaken door in the synagogue of Kriveldove, which means crooked oak or crooked oak, has been thrown open, then someone is bound to enter the breach, and that is none other than Menachem, whose name ironically means the one who brings comfort. Smoking a thin cigarette, he suddenly appears to deliver the great denunciation, to spell out the sacrilege, to repudiate the meaning of Jewish catastrophe. Noticing the book of records, he cries out to the community scribes, Shmei, don't forget to record the martyrs. Cohn, the porter, after all, died to sanctify God's name, and Burl, the thief, too, and Gittel, the hussy, took on 8 goyim, all for the sake of heaven. The rabbi only adds to his son's blasphemy by quoting God's answer to Job from out of the whirlwind. Is that right? And who created the world and the ocean and the 7 heavens? Was it you, perhaps? Was it you? So who created the bath and the bathhouse attendant? Comes Menachem's angry rebuttal. Was it me, perhaps? And who created the bean stew and the goats' beards and Grandma Train's cotton breeches? Was it me, perhaps? Oh, Lord of the universe, Master of the world, you mighty creator of Train's breeches, take under your wings the souls of these saints who suffered for the honor and love of your holy name, Jehovah. The congregation protests, shouting that for their sins and for the likes of Menachem, they are being punished by the Lord. For your sins, he laughs. Do you have the strength to sin? Do you even have the brains to sin? Denouncing the Jewish God in terms perhaps borrowed from Bialik, Menachem goes on to proclaim the dominion of the enemy God. Now there's a God for you, a true God of love. He wouldn't even hurt a fly. Yet look what he can do. Just look how he runs the world. The whole world belongs to him. A God, my dear Jews, has got to be good for something. A God, dear brothers and sisters, has got to be able to do something. After all, you too could be gods when it comes to not doing. So much for the impotent God of Israel. Menachem then rejects his defiled wife, kept virginal for nothing, denounces his own cowardice, and vows to extirpate the whole Jewish collective. Once the bearer of comfort, the natural leader, has broken loose from the fold, it is only a matter of time before the crooked oak is felled completely. In the years that follow, the lull between the pogroms and the Great War, the rabbi's home is reduced to a shadow. Old Slove still Old Slove still mans her post, but Gershon suffers a crisis of faith. He stops slaughtering. Rumors circulate about a renegade Jew turned priest, someone with an extraordinary voice and a bizarre talent for mimicry. He is inciting the peasants with stories about blood for Passover. The shtetl might dismiss these rumors out of hand, except that it was reminiscent of the Middle Ages, of Gonta, Khmelnytsky, the Hadamaks, half forgotten but familiar names, a strange sort of property that, once it was in their possession, Jews were loath to give away. Their suffering has become a commercial enterprise, a cynical covenant, so why should they give up their part of the bargain? For precisely these reasons, the renegade son is mobilizing the enemy from without. The war thrust Kriveldove into the abyss. Catastrophe strikes during the forced march of refugees. Families are trampled underfoot, and the rabbi is left to die alone. Gershon, too, is singled out. The animal in him springs forth in a moment of rebellion that we have come to expect in Shapiro's landscape of extremity. But once his tormentors are routed, he turns the aggression inward and throws himself off a precipice. Menachem reappears with shaven head and sunken cheeks for a last act of defiance against the Gentiles, to follow through on his earlier defiance against the Jews. As Menachem cries out in the agony of death, his voice is recognized by Slove, now old and senile, who survived all the pogroms, the torture, and the killing, and who traveled on the lost train until it was left stranded in the middle of nowhere. It is she who takes over in the end, the blind life force, nature personified, the only thing left, asking no questions and expecting no explanations. The Jewish people are back in the wilderness of Sinai, complete with fiery columns dancing through the sky, but with a very old woman in the lead, not a divinely inspired man. Just as 9-year-old Belk was the quintessential pogrom survivor, able to purge the violence through prolonged communion with nature and to stand as a symbol of non mechanical, vitalistic being, so is the ultimate resource a very old woman named Slove in Shapiro's story of World War and Revolution. Slove's loyalty and service contrast with the rebellious acts of Menachem and Gershon, the slaughter, presumably modeled on a real person of that name who perished near Kiev in 1919. Since in Shapiro's view, the Jewish state began to self-destruct even prior to the war, the rebelliousness of the Gershons and the Menachems, first against God and the Jews, and then against the Goyim, produced no lasting results. Both of them meet a self-consuming end, Gershon by committing suicide, and Menachem by dying so unheroically, defending a Jewish wheeler-dealer who was asking for trouble. All along, there were forces at work defining the hidden essences of life, Gershon's baritone and Slove's blind capacity to survive, but neither answered to history or ideology. After the destruction of the kingdom, only primal energies are left, a mythic struggle without heroes, a metaphysics without God. The world as a place of sheer destruction was the vision that Shapiro saved for last, for a story that dealt ostensibly with white Shalah and pogroms. To force the apocalypse on his readers, Shapiro did something that no Jewish writer had ever done before. He portrayed from the Gentiles' point of view the violence perpetuated against Jews. Previously relegated to stereotypic roles, the Goy was suddenly thrust center stage. Through Vassal, the speechless, historyless peasant, Shapiro traced the dehumanization of the average man from his first exposure to pain to his resurrection as a cannibal. Vassal is not born without feelings. One day, a neighbor broke the leg of a stray dog with a heavy stone, and when Vassal saw the sharp edge of the bone piercing the skin, he cried. He still has a chance to develop human responses, but he did not utter a sound. He is all mouth but has no language. So everything good has to be embodied, and everything bad is suffered in silence. The best thing in life is food, particularly the white challah. He once stole a piece and ate it, whereupon he stood for a time in a daze, an expression of wonder on his face. He did not understand it at all, but respect for white challah stayed with him. Beatings, in contrast, became the sole guide for human conduct. Wherever he goes, there is a pecking order of brutality, at home, in the army, and later on the front. Once the war breaks out, food and fighting become the essence of his being. In war, the cycle of nature works totally at odds with its accustomed rhythm in peacetime. When the soldiers fight in winter, there is food aplenty. In the spring, with nature in bloom, the army suffers its first major defeats. The officers give orders to withdraw, and mutiny ensues. The enemy within then takes the blame. Vassal knows about Jews from home. They are people who wore strange clothes, sat in stores, ate white challah, and had sold Christ. The last point was not quite clear. Who was Christ? Why did the Jews sell him? Who bought him? And for what purpose? It was all as though in a fog. The army is to teach him the plain meaning of that last point, namely that Jews are the enemy, but everything else about them eludes Vassal completely. There is a Nakum Rakik, for instance, a Jew who fights valiantly on the front. Why then does Rashek vomit green gall after the battle in which only he and Vassal remained alive? And why does Rashek admit to him after those leaflets were handed out among the soldiers that yes, Jews were responsible for everything in the slaughterhouse of war? Jewish sensibility and sarcasm clearly have no place. A full scale rout comes in the summer, completing the reverse cycle of death in life. Though the army is back on native ground, the fields are unrecognizable. So totally have they been wasted by the war. And while the armies crawled over the earth like swarms of gray worms, flocks of ravens soared overhead, calling with a dry rattling sound, the sound of tearing canvas, and swooped and slanted in intricate spirals, waiting for what would be theirs. The apocalypse unfolds, freed for the time being of Vassal's limited consciousness with heightened imagery, macabre sounds, and terrifying echoes from the Jewish past. By night, burning cities lighted their path, and by day, the smoke obscured the sun. This obvious inversion of the Exodus is followed by a list of imaginary place names that creates the illusion of specificity of an actual Eastern European landscape while invoking the memory of earlier catastrophes. The swift, narrow Seine Vodka River was entirely choked with human bodies a little below Lutzen and overflowed into the fields. Choked with human bodies a little abandoned by God to a nameless army that has already suffered massive annihilation in a nameless war and in whose ranks all moral and for its weakness whose ranks all moral and even military discipline have collapsed. The Jewish collective, chosen for its weakness, its age old culpability, and its civilized norms of behavior, is doomed. Even resistance is entirely futile against evil of such magnitude. Young Jewish men tried to resist and went out with the revolvers in their hands. The revolvers sounded like pop guns. The soldiers answered with thundering laughter and drew out the young men's veins one by one and broke their bones into little pieces. Progressively brutalized by forces beyond his control, swept into the of death. He breaks into a Jewish household demanding food, strikes out at the woman when she resists, and suddenly discovers the equation that has eluded him all his life. His eyes were dazzled, almost blinded. Half a breast, a beautiful shoulder, a full rounded hip, everything dazzling white and soft, like white challah. Damn it, these Jews are made of white challah. A searing flame leaped through his body. His arm flew up like a spring and shot into the gaping dress. He kills the husband, strangles the woman, and after she is dead, bites into her flesh, discovering further in this moment of cannibalistic ecstasy that white challah has the taste of a firm, juicy orange. Others before him, when pushed to the brink, gritted their teeth and bit their attackers. Vassal does more because his needs are so much greater. Killing is not enough. He has to suck the life giving juices from his enemy in order to gain her strength. In a circle, in a circle, the juices of life went from body to body, from the first to the second, from the second to the first, in a circle. For Vassal, all circles are now closed. Haunted since childhood by the Jewish enemy and yet hungry for their food, he refuses, in this ultimate act of rebellion, to accept anything less than his due. But the circle of his victimization has closed as well. He is the victim of rape, not the Jewish woman with her flesh of white challah. It is he whom society has utterly brutalized. Vassal is the antithesis of the man with the cross who, purged by the pogrom, could begin again. By revealing the other side of man, Vassal's act of cannibalism also reveals the other side of God. Pillars of smoke and pillars of flame rose to the sky from the entire city. Beautiful was the fire on the great altar. The cries of the victims, long drawn out, endless cries, were sweet in the ears of a God as eternal as the eternal God. And the tender parts, the thighs and the breast, were the portion of the priest. Both levels of the story, the real and the symbolic, come together in the double meaning of korbanos, victims as well as ritual sacrifices. Vassal thus takes his rightful share, not the substitute showbread of the temple, but the flesh of the human sacrifice. Besides the Mosaic cult that failed to humanize the animal instinct in man, it is Christianity that stands condemned in this parting tableau of desecration. For Vassal, acting on a central article of Christian faith, has inverted the priestly right of substituting the host for the flesh of Christ. There is no better substitute for the man on the cross than the flesh of another Jew. In the revelation of lamed Shapiro, therefore man reverts to beast. The Judeo-Christian heritage is replaced by a cult of human sacrifice. Nature revokes its life-giving capacities, and the beast of the apocalypse reigns supreme. Both physically and philosophically, Shapiro was in a better position to convey a sense of the universality of evil than were many of his younger colleagues with firsthand experience of the war and revolution. From the safety of New York and Chicago, where all his pogrom stories were written, Shapiro recognized that politics and culture had done little more than camouflage the collapse of society, and that with this collapse, man's primal aggression came increasingly to the fore. Through his use of an impressionistic style that focused on individual male and female perceptions of violence, Shapiro could suggest that existence of hidden realities and point to metaphysical themes that extended far beyond the confines of a given pogrom. Those, in contrast, who actually survived the battles, who were wounded and captured, who manned the barricades for the revolution, who defended their towns against the Ukrainian nationalists, and who later came out with memoirs or fictional accounts of their experience, often remained insular in their approach. The very title, Memoirs of a Jewish Army Officer or Prisoner of War or Political Commissar, announced an experience bracketed in time when the writer had been thrust head first into the maelstrom of history, had come out of it alive, and had been anxious to tell all. Rarely did the memoirist render the trench or barricade as emblematic of the age. He did not see the violence as something inescapable that was rapidly encroaching on all of mankind. He did not perceive that not just the self, but all of civilization was under siege. Even Avigdor Hammurabi struggled so hard with Greek mythology and binary oppositions in The Great Madness that this fictionalized war memoir appeared far too studied to make its case effective. In straight fiction, where there was much more room to tamper with reality, ideology ideology intervened to ensure an insular perspective. Hebrew writers, by virtue of the fact that they wrote in Hebrew and that the revolution proved inimical to their national aspirations, translated their lost faith into a recurrent plot. Their Jewish revolutionary heroes were brought back to the fold by story's end, and all of them discovered sooner or later that claims of blood ran deeper than love, ideology, or class. The Hebrew fictional soldier who returned from the front, Grisha Sokolov in Eliezer Steinman's The Jewish Soldier, Solomon Stufishkover in Abraham Freeman's 1919, Daniel Singer in Yitzhak Shinhar's Chapters from a Novel, began by embracing the Gentile world and its women and ended, however, ambivalently by defending the Jews. The one plot that revealed the degree of total estrangement of individual Jews was the one that told of the most heinous act of betrayal, Jews joining in the slaughter of other Jews. Shinhar dealt with this theme in Flesh and Blood, and for many years Shapiro tried in vain to exercise it through his art. But the plot of return and the plot of betrayal were still ways of delimiting the violence, of making it manageable. Only writers who were willing to see violence as the decisive and paradigmatic element in modern life, regardless of politics or place, could achieve a universality of vision compared to Shapiro's. In the immediate wake of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, Shapiro came as far as projecting an image of the world through the eyes of vassal. The next step was to portray a world full of vassals where every human being, whether peasant or rabbi's son, was rendered capable of perpetuating violence, and where ultimately the only choice that mattered was for the Jew willfully to become the other. With Isaac Babel, born 1894, and Israel Raybon, born 1900, we come to two writers who, in drawing a universal landscape of extremity, broke with the mold not only in terms of form, but also in terms of language. The tradition was no longer confined to Hebrew and Yiddish letters, for through acculturation and displacement, Eastern European Jewish writers had adopted Russian, Polish, German, French, and English as their media. This happened at a time when the symbiotic relationship between Hebrew and Yiddish had also come to an end. A cosmopolitanism of style confused matters worse, even further, making it possible to write in one language as if one were writing in another. There was nothing recognizably Yiddish in the style or worldview of Israel Raybon, and the similarities between Babel and Shapiro owed as much to their adoration of Chekhov and de Maupassant as to their common Ukrainian Jewish heritage. A Yiddish writer schooled in cosmopolitanism could abstain from using Jewish cultural symbols even when treating the theme of catastrophe just as a Russian writer feeling thoroughly at home in his medium could make the Jew into everyman. Defying the limitations of language, culture, and audience, both writers pressed their vision of the universality of violence. Raybon served in the Polish army in 1920, the same year that Babel was fighting on the other side as war correspondent in Badyani's 1st Cavalry. Raybon's approach was to make the street into a landscape of modern violence. In this picaresque novel, a precursor to Celine's Journey to the End of the Night, Raybon operated with two opposing sets of analogies: animal comparisons that reduced all human actions to those of dogs, tigers, horses, and the like, and crucifixion scenes, which he saw as the only mythic symbol that did the terror justice. Since the hero alternated between nightmare and reality, each took on the character of the other, and in the confusion lay the eloquence that enforced factuality. Raybon's hero returns from the front with nowhere to go and no profession to speak of. He settles in Lodz purely by chance, lodging sometimes in a dark cellar, sometimes in a park, and sometimes in a flop house. His only past consists of memories of pain and humiliation. Um, Sorry, lost my spot. Okay. Pain and humiliation. I'm sorry, pain and humiliation from childhood and of 4 years spent in the war. The crazy cobbler from whom he rents a room is fond of playing war games, and once so drunk that he becomes the Polish general incarnate, he forces an impoverished Swabian child to play the role of the Kaiser. With other cellar children helping out, the cobbler drags the Kaiser, kicking and screaming, off to be hanged, literally hanged, and only the hero's intervention prevents this combination of murder, animal sacrifice, and war game from being carried out. Not surprisingly, the circus and cinema are the most lifelike places in town, and here the hero meets a panoply of clowns, wrestlers, crazy poets, and loose women in whose company he feels almost at home. In the midst of his street life, he recalls a central episode of the war, prefigured as a fantasy. Out of hunger, more real than imagined, he fantasizes being baked alive in a huge oven, lying crucified on the baker's trough, and being devoured. Later, as he actually lies feverish in the dark and empty circus tent, he remembers an experience from the last days of the war. He was wounded in battle and awoke at night on a snow covered step with no refuge from the extreme cold and nothing to eat or drink. At the end of his tether, he stumbled over the body of a dying horse. Like a famished child senses the smell of his mother's breast at night, that's how I sensed the presence of something warm. It was a question of survival. With his last bit of strength, he slashed open the stomach of the beast, pulled out its innards, and crawled in. Oh, how warm I felt, how warm. This double reversion, man becoming beast and man returning to the womb, is shocking enough, but wishes to convey the extremity of war in other than naturalistic terms alone. And so, on awakening, his hero crawled out into the cold morning air and was immediately frozen to the spot. From head to toe, covered in a bloody red armor made of frozen Bordeaux red blood. I couldn't let my arms down. They were spread out. My feet stuck to the ground, and I looked like a crucifix. My God, I had become implanted in the ground like a red, bloody crucifix. I, a bloody crucifix on a white Russian steppe. This bloody tableau is reminiscent of Warshawski's red meat wrapped around the female smuggler's body, an image of radical nakedness that goes beyond the skin. Raybon, however, takes the image of man as bloody beast much further than Warshawski. Here, in the battlefield sequence, it is an image sufficiently real to suggest the end point of human transformation and sufficiently eloquent to paint the war as the crucifixion of mankind. The fact that this man also happens to be a Jew adds force to the equation but is not central to its meaning. For the thrust of Raybon's post-war vision is of humanity stripped naked of an urban jungle where only that which is imagined, the fleeting glance of a woman, the silent movie pageant, the laughter of a dying clown, is real, and all meaningful human interaction lasts only as long as the circus or the movie runs. In Babel's view, the universality of violence could be apprehended only through history. In the texture of local dialect, ethnic idiosyncrasies, and religious passions. His very first story, inspired by events of that year, 1913, told of the expulsion of Jews from the villages, the same theme that Shalom Aleichem picked up for the last two episodes of the Tevye stories. Babel's lifelong attraction to extremes of peripheral intelligence was already evident in the character of old Shloim, deaf and dirty, who tapped a hidden source of defiance when he learned of his son's plan to avert expulsion by converting to Christianity. Rather than submit to the forces of history, old Shloim hung himself in the middle of the night. Though not a practicing Jew, he would tell God how they've hurt him. After all, God exists, God will accept him, and that of Shloim was convinced. The deeper Babel treaded in the landscape of violence, the tougher his prose became. Gorky, so the story goes, sent him out into the world to experience history firsthand. And when he came back from serving on the Romanian front, he wrote for Gorsky's virulently anti-Bolshevik paper, The New Life, Novaya Shin. With a matter-of-fact style, Babel chronicled the chaos and the abuse of revolutionary power as he saw it unfold in the streets and state institutions of Petrograd. These slice of life reports invariably ended on a sardonic note. All this I have seen myself. The sullen, barefoot children, the puffed, pimply faces of their gloomy mentors, and the broken sewage pipes. Our poverty and wretchedness are truly unsurpassed. A fine institution, a stunted kind of life that will be. We've seen enough of that kind of life, the stunted kind, premature babies. To further hone his spare, ironic and amazingly compact style, he rewrote someone else's observations on war and made of their flowery French original something almost on his own. Then he joined the Cossacks. The diary he kept that year reveals both the factual basis for many of his Red Cavalry stories, the real life models for characters such as Gadali, the rabbi, and Grishik, not to speak of the commander, Semyon Budyani himself, who later denounced the collection as erotomaniacal garbage and Babel's despair at being unfit for the work of destruction. The challenge was not simply to convey the layers of worthlessness, daring professionalism, revolutionary spirit, and bestial cruelty that characterized his comrades in arms, but to purge his own revulsion, his rabbinic sensibilities, so as to transmute the horror into a higher level of reality. Nothing could have been more difficult. On August 20th, he recorded an episode in which 10 Polish prisoners of war, including one Jew, were shot in cold blood. That made Babel an accomplice to the murder, or so at least it appeared in the story version he wrote, in which the Jewish prisoner, a clerk from Lodz, pleaded with the narrator for mercy. "You are a Jude, sir," he whispered, frantically fondling my stirrup. "You are," he squealed, the spittle dribbling from his mouth and his whole body convulsed with joy. "Get back into line, Schulmeister," I shouted at the Jew, and suddenly, overcome by a deathly feeling of faintness, I began to slip from the saddle, and choking, I said, "How did you know?" "You have that nice Jewish look about you," he said in a shrill voice, hopping on one leg and leaving the thin dog's trail behind him. "That nice Jewish look, sir." However, However much he might dissociate himself from a fellow Jew by describing him as a wounded dog, the murder weighed so heavily that the narrator felt compelled to make notes about each of the 10 prisoners. Nobody else but me would do this in the Red Cavalry. While he, the man of conscience, was busy taking notes, the Cossacks were plundering the beehives nearby, and I put aside my pen. I was horrified at the great number of memorials still to be written. Now, this was a story that Babel himself expunged from the collection. Only Squadron Commander Trunov, who ordered the execution, was deemed worthy of a memorial, not as a murderer, but as the heroic protector of his men. For the men of the Red Cavalry came to represent to Babel a new code of behavior in which nothing but the exercise of extreme power could soothe a man from the terror that he suffered. An honor code in which not to kill a wounded comrade was the highest act of immorality and selfishness. In Red Cavalry, unquestionably a central work of modern fiction, Babel raised his conversion to the Cossack code of violence to a choice of universal significance. The Bolshevik campaign to occupy Poland took Yoltov, the narrator, through a mutilated landscape of absolute extremity, a world in which sensation was all that ultimately mattered. Amid the ruins of ancient cathedrals, nobles, estates, and countless shtetl, Yultov was initiated into killing, the victim being a goose that was to be served for dinner. Yutov's heart, stained with bloodshed, grated and brimmed over. Later, he discovered the rapture of first possession, to have a little cart called Tachan- Tachanka, all his own, with a driver named Grishuk, thrown in for good measure. Meanwhile, he came upon people of his faith, Bird like Gadali, for instance, visionary of a joyous revolution, who changed Utov to choose between the turbulent winds of history and the passionate edifice of Hasidism. And even when the Hasidic rabbi Motal came out on top with clever jibes at the narrator's expense, this only made the contest more interesting. Whether wanting to or not, the reader found himself rooting for Utov to become more extreme, more masculine, more like a Cossack. Toward the very end of the quest in the story, The Rabbi's Son, Babel gave the Jewish Christian reader one last chance to identify with the Torah as the preferred symbol of humanity before he, Utov, chose horses instead, renounced his past humanity before he renounced his past and his Judaism, surrendered his particularly to embrace the strangely beautiful Cossack code of violence. Months passed and my dream came true. The Cossacks stopped watching me and my horse. Life in Babel's scheme was a series of initiations into violence, whether one lived at home with one's parents, the story of my dovecot, or set out from home on a journey, as in The Journey, 1932. And if one had the good fortune to grow up in Odessa, the southern outpost of the Russian sun, then one knew of a clan of Moldovanka, Baal Goose, Mandolin Vinya, Froim, and Yupka, Jew and a half, and the king, for whom the exercise of violence was no more than the full blooded passion for life. The Red Cavalry was the fullest expression of a life in which every human being, including the son of a rabbi, was made a partner to violence, and in which the bespectacled Utov prayed fervently to God to grant him the simplest of proficiencies, the ability to kill his fellow men. To kill, to be as real as everything around him, to be like the universe, like history. No less important than Utov's conversion to the Cossack code of violence was Babel's apparent success in purging his rabbinic sensibilities in order to write about catastrophe and destruction in the modern age. Despite the temptation nowadays to rehabilitate Babel the Jew in light of his tragic end and the end of all Jewish culture in the Soviet Union, one must take his writing in context and appreciate the extent of his radical break with the Jewish past. It is It is crucial to understand the precise nature of the traditions that stood in his way that he, as a Jew, felt he had to overcome. Playing the role of dutiful son, intoning Kano, and rehearsing the destruction of the shtetl of Demidovka as his mother sat howling on the floor was the surest means of rendering the Cossack violence trans temporal. Babel would dissociate himself from the use of such archetypes, from the characters who employed them, and most certainly from their attendant theology of sin, retribution, and redemption. Even Gedali's syncretism, messianism, was not his. Instead, Babel would push the historical context, the here and now in all its specificity, with an eye for strategic detail almost unsurpassed in modern fiction. Though rabbinic midrash and medieval chronicles were not devoid of atrocity stories, Jews were reticent about referring explicitly to physical violence. More often than not, violence was done to things, sanctuary, Torah scrolls, pillows, and hearth, in lieu of detailed mutilation, rape, and murder. In Babel, everything from the moon to a man's horse could suffer violence. He talked about the stars and about gonorrhea in the same tone of voice, wrote Victor Shlovolsky. For images, Babel drew equally upon the odor of crucifixes and the carved gray stones of the old Jewish cemetery. In his famous Requiem to the Rabbi's Son, he listed the portraits of Lenin and Maimonides lying side by side, pages of the Song of Songs, and revolver cartridges. Just as Babel mixed symbol systems, he refused to make the Jewish destruction separate from the rest of the world. Rather than the communal dislocation insisted upon in Jewish sources, Babel would insist on individual dislocation, physical, social, emotional, and psychic. In his work, there was a modern emphasis on sensation as opposed to mind in the encounter with disaster. And only when the individual was finally cut off from the sustaining archetypes, from the exalted messianic schemes, from the insular perspective on destruction, from the communal saga from the past, from his own set of inherited symbols could he then hope to enact his will in history and through history? This was the generation of iron men that Shapiro had called for. Whether such men and women too would rebuild the ruins was the question that only history could answer.